maybe the next question would be, in terms of the cost to you personally, again, choosing to go down this path of which you can't talk about it, you can't critique it without yourself consuming it in a sense by looking at this stuff. I mean, I've done media studies, and I've done mostly looking at like news, like hours of news every day and whatnot. And people say, "Why would you choose it?" So they're like, "Yeah, it has an effect on you." But I'm just wondering how you have dealt with that. I mean, how it has affected you by choosing to kind of consciously look at this stuff, even as difficult as it may be.
Yeah, it's the subject of many jokes from men about how I study pornography and then have to look at it, and men will say to me, "That sounds like a great job, to get paid to look at pornography." And of course, the minute that you move from being a consumer of pornography who is using it for sexual pleasure into being a critic and looking at it, then it becomes a very different enterprise. And you start to see the underlying misogyny, the woman-hating that saturates pornography. You start to see the way it constructs men as a kind of brute animal. And you say to yourself, "Oh my goodness, I've spent my life, trying to fill that role in relationship to women. Is this what I've become?" And it's not fun. And then you start to see the brutality, the denigration of women, the cruelty of it, that when you used it as a consumer, you didn't see. And I can say that it isn't, it's not a trivial question, and I've dealt with it in really two ways. One is I've limited my exposure. I do periodic studies of the content of video pornography, usually about every 3 years, and then that's it. So I confine that to a very concentrated period of viewing, and only every few years. And that itself is very difficult. The aftermath of that week of viewing, I try to stay away from other people for a while, because it really does take its toll on me emotionally. Beyond the actual viewing, just constantly being engaged with and arguing about and talking about it also can be very emotionally draining, because when you bring it up in public, then you're creating a space for other people, and it is very intense. So I deal with it, number one, by limiting my viewing, and number two, I think by realizing there's a point at which it's good to stop. So the research that led to the book was what I hope will be my last study of video pornography, quite frankly, because number one, I just don't know how long I can do it. It does wear you down in a certain way. And in fact, I intended to watch a little more of it than I did for this last one, and sort of midway through it I just said enough. I was trying to listen to my own sort of emotional and embodied life and stop. And so what I'd like now is, especially for younger men, to take up this, because I'm done. I'm tired and I'm old.
I really appreciated how you kind of began the conversation today at the presentation around sort of, looking, just in terms of like you would any sort of media studies in a sense. And if you were trying to, speak to, again, you're addressing parents or men in particular, and you're trying to look at this from just kind of a media literacy kind of point of view, which, tries to advocate for deconstructing and so forth. But you don't see a whole lot of media literacy proponents talking about pornography, and I'm wondering if you could respond to why you think that might be, but also if I was coming at it from a media literacy angle, how might one approach pornography?
It's a bit of a paradox in a sense, because if you take people who have generally progressive politics, they're trying to expand the scope of freedom and justice in the world. One of the places many of us who would count ourselves in that group look is media, because in a media-saturated, mass-mediated culture, it's rather obvious you have to look at how the world is constructed through media. And so we do things like critique the implicit racism in a lot of Hollywood action films, for instance, that are always constructing the Arab, the Muslim, as the terrorist, as the source of all violence and evil in the world. Well, we look at that and we say there's some implicit racism here. We look at the way Hollywood films often objectify women and trivialize women in that sense. We look at the way that capitalism, the buying and selling of everything, so infuses our media system. and those are important things to look at. So we have misogyny and patriarchy, we have racism and white supremacy, we have the commodification of everything in corporate capitalism. Well, there's no better example of that than pornography, where overt women hating, overt racism, and the commodification of even the most intimate spaces of our emotional and physical lives are bought and sold in the market. Well, I think I would agree. For people with progressive politics, and I mean that in a broad sense, concerned with making the world a better place, should understand that a critique of pornography is central to media criticism in the context of sexism, racism, and capitalism. Yet many of those same people who would critique those things in those other media genres are fearful of pornography. Why is that? Well, one reason is because the pornography industry has done a very good job of painting anyone who's critical of their products as a prude, as a conservative religious nut, as a, someone who's got their own sexual hang-ups. And that discourages a certain number of people. The other thing is because so much of the past critique of pornography has been from a conservative point of view and been repressive and tried to use the law to shut down not only these very misogynistic porn producers, but a whole lot of healthy sexual expression, people are understandably wary about it, and I think that's important. There also is a First Amendment question. How do we treat sexually explicit media that seem to be connected to the harms that come from sexism and racism, for instance? So on the one hand, I think people have been have allowed themselves to be bullied by the industry into being silent. On the other hand, people have legitimate concerns about some of these things. But the other thing we can't ignore is that a whole lot of people who are progressive, especially progressive men, are also pornography users. That is, their own sexuality is very much connected to their use of sexually explicit media. And when you critique pornography, let's not be shy about saying it, you're suggesting that that is no longer an acceptable way to experience sexual pleasure. You're saying to men who use pornography, it's time to stop. And we know that, whatever we are, whether we're straight or gay, celibate or sexually active, we know that our sexuality is crucial to us. And if your whole life you've been essentially socialized to experience sexual pleasure in a certain way, through media, through the subordination of women, and then somebody says you have to stop, well, that's threatening. I mean, it's true. It was certainly difficult for me. It took me a long time to come to understand the feminist critique, even before I endorsed it, simply because I think I intuitively knew it was a threat to the way I had learned to be sexual. And I also, don't want to be naive. One doesn't get from being rooted in a sexuality, a commodified sexuality and male domination, to some other way of experiencing sexuality and intimacy, overnight. It's a long struggle. In some ways, it's a struggle I'm still engaged in, 20 years after first thinking about this. So there is a cost in that sense. But the flip side of that, of course, is if one is willing to struggle, it takes you to a place that, for me at least, has been far richer and deeper and more intimate. That is, my own personal life is not only one of struggle, but it's also one of moments of transcendence, of moments of experiencing something I had never experienced before. And that's powerful. And we always have to keep in mind, whatever the way in which it looks risky, there's also a payoff to taking those risks, which is true of most of life. The things that end up being the most satisfying and fulfilling are often the things that scare us the most initially.